Should the White Sox leave Chicago? Just like the A's leaving Oakland or the Rays leaving Tampa, the White Sox are the latest team to be mentioned for relocation. This isn't the first time the threat of leaving town has come from the White Sox organization. It came up in the 80s when the Sox were looking for a replacement for the 80-year-old Comiskey Park. They threatened to move to St. Petersburg before the Rays existed, and eventually got a new ballpark, the new Comiskey Park, now renamed Guaranteed Rate Field. We've seen this before, not only in Chicago but elsewhere in North America. Give us a new ballpark or we'll find somewhere else to play. Most of the time it results in the team getting a new stadium, like we saw in Miami just over a decade ago. But sometimes an agreement on a new ballpark is never reached, and the team really does leave. The Expos left Montreal 20 years ago for that reason, and now the A's are planning on moving to Las Vegas. And if they can't figure out something in Tampa, the Rays may be in search of a new city. Team owner Jerry Reinsdorf has dismissed all the rumors about the team moving. He's owned the White Sox for over 40 years. I believe him when he says he has no intention of moving the team or selling the team to someone else. But he's 87 now. He won't be around too much longer. The next owner might be more business-minded, without such a strong connection to the city. The Rays leaving Tampa wouldn't be too shocking, especially if they just moved to neighboring Orlando, or if they moved to Montreal and revived the old team there. The Rays have only been in existence for 25 years. It won't be hard to imagine MLB without Tampa, because it existed for a long time without Tampa, and a lot of people still remember that. The A's leaving Oakland was a little harder to take. They've been in Oakland for about half a century, longer than most of us have been alive. They've won the World Series 4 times in Oakland. Though the team started in Philly and also played in Kansas City, it's hard for a lot of people to imagine them playing anywhere else. Now just imagine the White Sox moving. The team has been in Chicago for 123 years, one of the few teams from the first decade of the 1900s that still plays in the same city under the same name today. No one really wants to see the Sox play in another city, but that may have to happen someday, and some think that should happen by the end of this decade. Why would they think of leaving? A lot of people are pointing to the crime, especially the incident of a stray bullet allegedly entering the stadium from outside. Yes, crime is a problem in Chicago, but I don't think that's the reason. Chicago's always had a crime problem, and as bad as it is now, it was worse decades ago. So I'm sure that wouldn't be a reason for them leaving. The real reason may be that Chicago, one day, will not be able to support 2 Major League Baseball teams. Look at the census from 1900, about the time that Major League Baseball started. New York was the biggest city, Chicago number 2, then Philadelphia, St. Louis, and Boston. 9 of the 10 largest cities were either on the East Coast, no further south than Baltimore, or in the Midwest, no further west than St. Louis. San Fran was the exception. The West didn't have many people, and this was before the invention of the airplane, so no teams were being put out west. With Major League Baseball only covering less than a third of the country, it's no surprise that the biggest cities all got 2 teams. Braves and Red Sox in Boston, as they'd later be known, Browns and Cardinals in St. Louis, A's and Phillies in Philadelphia, Cubs and Sox in Chicago. New York, more than twice the size of the second largest city, got 3 teams, eventually becoming known as the Yankees, Dodgers, and Giants. Now look at 1950. The top 3 did not change, but Los Angeles was now number 4 and didn't have a team yet, nor did any team out west, though air travel had greatly improved. St. Louis and Boston were now 8th and 10th respectively, and it was obvious that their time as 2-team cities had to come to an end. By 1953, the Browns had moved to Baltimore and became the Orioles. The Braves moved to Milwaukee. Philly, though still a very large city, was about to get passed by LA for number 3. Their share of the country's population had decreased significantly, and they inevitably had to lose one of their teams. In 1954, the A's relocated to Kansas City. These were teams that had been in those cities since MLB started half a century earlier. They'd built their own traditions and rivalries. Seeing them leave town must have been really hard for the city's residents and supporters. Imagine being a 50-year-old in St. Louis. You've been rooting for the Browns your whole life. Probably don't like the Cardinals at all. Then one day you're told that St. Louis will from here on out be a 1-team city. Sucks for that guy. But can you imagine St. Louis having 2 teams today? Or Boston? Or Philly? No way it would work. There were big changes in demographics in the first half of the 20th century, and starting in the 1950s, Major League Baseball had to catch up with those changes. So, in the next few decades, there were several expansion teams and relocated teams on the West Coast, a few in the South, a couple in Canada too. By the 1980s, MLB had 26 teams in mostly all the right cities. The MLB map looked like it represented the current population of North America. In the 90s, MLB tried to further keep up with the demographic changes. The population was shifting from the Northeast and Midwest to the South and West, a change that is still occurring today. 4 new teams were added, bringing them up to the 30 teams we have today, but this time it didn't go so well. Florida was, by this time, the 4th most populous state, and it didn't have a major league team yet. Phoenix had become one of the 10 largest cities, and it didn't have a team either. So during the 90s, Florida was awarded 2 teams, the Tampa Bay Devil Rays and the Florida Marlins. Phoenix got the Arizona Diamondbacks, and Denver, another growing city, got the Colorado Rockies. All 4 expansion cities seemed like good ideas, but in the 25 to 30 years since then, 3 of the 4 teams have struggled with attendance. Only the Rockies have seen good attendance figures. This may have to do with the fact that during the 70s, 80s, and 90s, football replaced baseball as America's #1 sport. In the 21st century, baseball fell down one more spot, as basketball rose to the #2 position. The days where a major league team could move into any large, growing city and expect it to be the biggest sports attraction in town were long gone. Expansion had to be thought out more carefully. It also may have to do with the fact that Florida and Arizona already had their role in Major League Baseball as the home of spring training. Local residents already had their team loyalties and couldn't just drop those loyalties to support the new team in town. Lots of transplants too, especially in Florida with all the retirees. These people moved to Florida for the weather, not to find a new team to root for. Whatever the reason, Major League Baseball has been wary of expansion, and we've been stuck with the same team since '98. The only change being the Expos Nationals moving from one large metro to another. That had nothing to do with changing demographics. If you look at the ranking of cities, metro areas, and combined statistical areas today, you'll see that MLB has failed to keep up. The NBA was the first to open up in growing metros like Portland, Salt Lake City, and San Antonio. NFL and NHL are both in Vegas. NFL, NHL, and NBA are all in Tennessee and Carolina. Those are places that have risen up in the past few decades. But if you look at a map of major league cities, it looks like it represents the American population from half a century ago. So it seems like MLB is overdue for a series of relocations, as was seen in the 1950s, after the MLB map had not changed in a long time. Could this be that baseball is more of a traditional sport now? It's not the hottest new thing. MLB might get more support in places like Pittsburgh or Cincinnati because of the team's long presence there. It's easier for a young kid to want to support the same team his father, grandfather, and even great-grandfather supported than it is for someone in a newer city getting a brand new team, with a new name, no tradition. So there will have to be a big difference in population if MLB is going to ditch one of its current cities for a new, faster-growing market. Another thing that makes baseball different when considering expansion is that city size is just as important, if not more important, than the size of the combined statistical area. If you're bringing an NFL team to town, you can count on residents within a couple hours' drive to come flooding in on Sunday to fill the stands. MLB plays more than half its games on weekdays. People aren't going to drive from the outer suburbs to attend games on Tuesday nights when they've got work the next day. For the weekend, sure, and that'll help to bring the average attendance up. But teams still aim for at least 20,000 on weeknights, and that mostly comes from within the most immediate area. NBA and NHL also play on weekdays, but playing in indoor arenas, their attendance expectations are far less. Knowing all this, why would MLB give up on Chicago? It's the 3rd largest city, 3rd largest metro area. Illinois is the 6th largest state by population. Well, for one thing, they wouldn't be giving up on Chicago, obviously, since there are 2 teams already. And this is something that every White Sox fan has always known. If one team has to leave Chicago, it's not going to be the Cubs. It's the same reality that fans of the St. Louis Browns and Boston Braves had to deal with last century. The Sox have just as many fans in the city, possibly more, but the Cubs are a more popular team overall. They bring in more fans from outside Chicago, particularly from downstate Illinois and northwest Indiana. They always beat the Sox in attendance. They aren't going anywhere. If the MLB map is going to line up with the current demographics, Chicago will need to have about twice as many people as another viable city in order to support 2 teams. Nashville was brought up as a relocation possibility for the Sox. They are trying to get an expansion team, and I think they should get a team one way or another. A relocation team is a lot easier, though. Let's see, Chicago has 2.7 million people, more than 3 times as many as Nashville's 690,000. Metro population of Chicago is 9.4 million, more than 4 times that of Nashville's 2 million. So split Chicago into 2 cities, north and south, and both cities are more than big enough to have major league teams. End of discussion, right? Well, not really. It's not so much where a city is, but what direction it's going in. After all, the Athletics left Philly when it was still the 3rd largest city in America. The city of Nashville has been gaining about 10,000 residents per year lately, about 1% population growth annually. Chicago, on the other hand, has been trending downward since the 1960 census. A couple times it's had a small rebound, but not enough to make up for the losses in other decades. And according to an article in May of this year from ABC Chicago, the metro area has a net loss of 294,000 people in the last 5 years, with all signs showing that the trend will continue in the years to come. Chicago has already been passed by Toronto in population and will probably be passed by Houston this decade. Its status as the third largest metro area should remain a little longer, with Dallas-Fort Worth surpassing Chicago maybe in the 2030s. By 2040, Chicago could be the fifth largest city and fifth largest metro in the United States. Okay, that's down from where they are now, but it's still pretty big, and the fan loyalty is there. Even if they continue to bleed residents annually in this decade and the next, I'm pretty sure that a pennant-winning White Sox team can average 30,000 fans a game over an entire season. A winning team makes all the difference. But of course, you can't count on your team winning 100 games every year. They've still got to make money when the team's down. And if stadiums weren't an issue, I'd say just stay till it's no longer profitable to remain in the city. But if you're going to build a new ballpark, that's going to take a long commitment to the area you're operating in. If it's heading in a downward direction now, do you really want to still be there in a few decades when it's much worse? I can't imagine a new stadium going up in Chicago. I just don't see that happening. Alternative options that have been brought up are building one in the suburbs or playing at Soldier Field. As I said before, a stadium works best in the city where most of the population is. That's especially important for weekday games. No suburb of Chicago is densely populated enough to support a Major League Baseball team. If they are determined to keep the Sox in Chicago for now, don't want to build a new stadium, and don't want to play at Guaranteed Rate Field anymore, Soldier Field would be a good temporary solution. The Bears might be moving out anyway, so they need to find some use for the venue, but I don't think it would be an attractive venue for baseball. It might be cool at first, but then when the novelty wears off, attendance for White Sox games at Soldier Field would be lower than it is right now. So we know that Chicago is big enough to support two teams and will be for at least a couple decades, but there will come a time when it's no longer one of the biggest cities in the U.S., and with so many other cities rising up and wanting a team of their own, Chicago's long history of being a two-team city will probably have to come to an end. With the stadium lease expiring in 2028, is now the best time to bail on Chicago, start over again in a new city, with new fans, possibly a new name? Or should they stay as long as they possibly can, make things work at their current venue, or try it out at Soldier Field? Some might think that Chicago will one day turn things around. If you're one of those people, I admire your optimism. I'm not trying to slam Chicago here. I was born in the area. My first Major League game was a White Sox game. I don't want to see Chicago fail, and I don't want to see it lose one of its teams. The city's not going to die, but just like Boston and St. Louis before it, it's going to become just another city. And what is that magic number? The number that the population gets down to, signaling that it's time to leave town. Trick question, there is no such number. It depends on how many people go to the games, not how many people live nearby. Think about it, Miami's got a lot more people than St. Louis, but if you had to move one team, would it be the Marlins or the Cardinals? The south side of Chicago, if we count it as a separate city from the north, could probably support the Sox long after its population falls below that of other cities of comparable size. But they've got more competition from other sports. Whereas cities like St. Louis, Cincinnati, Pittsburgh, and Kansas City have one or two other major professional sports teams, Chicago has a team for every sport. Sports fans in Chicago don't go to Sox games by default. And they've got to think about what happens to all the Sox fans in Chicago after the Sox leave town. I don't know what happened in St. Louis in the 1950s when the Browns left. Maybe Browns fans became Cards fans overnight. Or maybe it took a generation for the city to truly become a one-team town. Fans there would have had no choice, really. Baseball was at the top of the sports landscape in America. If they didn't support the Cards, they'd be missing out on it. Besides, the Cards were a team known for winning over the years. Browns were known for losing. The same thing, I'm sure, would not happen in Chicago. Definitely not overnight. Sox fans hate the Cubs. Would they gradually warm up to the Northside team? Doubt it. This isn't the 1950s. Fans don't feel like they need a baseball team. Fans there will just continue to support the Bears, Bulls, and Blackhawks and stop watching baseball altogether. Then MLB as an organization loses half of a major city. If the Sox do stay in Chicago for now, which I hope they do, they should continue to use Guaranteed Rate Field. A brand new stadium for this team, in the city or in the suburbs, would be a waste of money. I think there will come a day when Chicago only has one Major League Baseball team, and that day will come before I die. But we're still decades away from that needing to happen. Let's not rush the team's departure when they're still attracting crowds and making money where they are. It's worth keeping the team around, just not worth building a new ballpark for. But anyway, that's just what I think. Let me know what you think down in the comments. That's all for this one, and until next time, this is Baseball International. See ya.